The thing about New York City in the summer of 1943 was that it hummed. It wasn't a gentle hum, mind you. It was a brash, confident, jazz-infused roar of life. And for a young man named Elijah Jones, the best part of that roar came from a little music shop on 135th Street in Harlem. Elijah wasn't a big man. He was lean and wiry, with clever hands that were made for two things: fixing clocks and playing the harmonica. The harmonica was his true love. It was a Hohner Marine band, its nickel plating worn to a soft glow from countless hours in his pocket against his lips. He could make that little instrument weep, laugh, and swing with a soul that belied its small size. Today, he was making it sing a sweet, lazy version of St. Louis blues, his foot tapping softly against a stack of sheet music. The shop owner, old Mr. Henderson, nodded along, his eyes closed. The bell above the door jangled, breaking the spell. In walked two men Elijah knew well: Corporal Marcus Big Mac Johnson, who was built like the proverbial brick house, and Private Samuel Preacher Wilkins, who carried a Bible in one pocket and a deck of cards in the other. They were sharp in their 369th Infantry Regiment uniforms, the Harlem Hellfighters patch proud on their shoulders. "Listen to that, Preacher," Big Mac boomed, his voice filling the small shop. "Sounds like a lovesick angel." Elijah lowered the harmonica, grinning. "Just keeping the air fresh, Mac. You two look like you're on a mission." "We are," Preacher said, his voice quieter, more serious. He held out a folded piece of paper. "We all are, Eli. Orders came through. We're shipping out. Next week." The world seemed to go silent for a moment. The hum of the city faded. Elijah looked from Preacher's solemn face to Mac's forced grin. He'd known this was coming, had volunteered for it, but seeing the orders in black and white was a different thing altogether. It was like a clock finally striking an hour he'd been dreading. That night, the mood at the Savoy Ballroom was a mix of defiant joy and simmering anxiety. The music was louder, the dancing more frantic, as if everyone was trying to pack a lifetime of joy into one last night. Elijah was on a small stage with a jazz combo, his harmonica weaving a silvery thread through the brassy sound of the trumpets. He played for the couples swaying on the dance floor, for the soldiers laughing a little too loudly, for the women with worried eyes. After his set, he found his girl, Lena, waiting for him by the bar. She was a seamstress, with fingers just as clever as his, and eyes that saw right through him. "You played like you were saying goodbye," she said softly, lacing her fingers with his. "Maybe I was," he admitted. "To all of this." She reached into her purse and pulled out a small, soft leather pouch. "I made this for you. For your harmonica." Elijah took it. The leather was supple, and she had tooled a beautiful, swirling design on the front. It was a piece of home, a piece of her. He slipped the Hohner out of his pocket and into the pouch. It fit perfectly. "I don't want you to go," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But I'm so proud of you I could burst." "You show them, Elijah Jones. You show them what a Harlem Hellfighter can do." The train ride to Camp Stewart in Georgia was a journey into a different America. The easy camaraderie of their Harlem streets tightened, became a protective shield as the landscape changed and the stairs grew longer and colder. They were soldiers of the United States, yet they were made to ride in segregated cars, eat in separate mess halls. The enemy wasn't just across the ocean. He was wearing the same uniform but looking at them with open contempt. Their training was brutal, a relentless grind under a blistering sun. Sergeant Williams, a man with a voice like grinding gravel and a hidden heart of gold, pushed them harder than anyone. "They don't think you've got the grit," he'd roar. "They think you'll break. So you will not break. You will be harder than steel. You are Hellfighters. Now act like it." Through it all, Elijah's harmonica was his anchor. In the barracks at night, when the air was thick with homesickness and fear, he'd play. Not loud, jubilant jazz, but slow, bluesy melodies that spoke of moonlit New York streets and the scent of Lena's perfume. The soft notes would drift through the dark room, and the grunts and snores would quieten as the men listened. Big Mac would close his eyes and smile. Preacher would nod slowly, as if in prayer. For a few minutes, they weren't soldiers in a segregated army. They were just homesick boys, connected by a thread of music. The day they were told they wouldn't be fighting under the American flag, but would be assigned to the French army, a stunned silence fell over the unit. "The French," Big Mac muttered, confused. "Why the French?" Sergeant Williams stood before them, his jaw tight. Politics, he spat the word out like a bad taste. But listen up. It doesn't matter whose uniform they put you in. You are still Hellfighters. And the French are desperate for men. They'll be happy to see us. And we will show them what we're made of. We will earn our place. As they boarded the massive troop ship, a hulking shadow in the New York harbor, Elijah stood at the railing. The Manhattan skyline was a jagged silhouette against a fiery dawn. He felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Preacher. "Don't look back, son," Preacher said. "The Lord's work is ahead of us now, in strange and terrible places." Elijah nodded, his throat too tight for words. He put his hand in his pocket, feeling the familiar shape of the harmonica in its leather pouch. It was the one piece of his old world he was taking into the unknown. The ship's horn blasted, a deep, mournful sound that seemed to shake the very sky. The water churned, and the great vessel began to move. He was leaving everything he loved behind. But as he turned from the fading skyline and looked at the faces of his brothers, Mac's determined scowl, Preacher's calm faith, the young, scared boys trying to look brave, he knew he wasn't alone. They were the 369th. They were the Harlem Hellfighters. And they were sailing into the heart of the storm. The Atlantic was a gray, heaving monster. For 2 weeks, their troop ship was a tiny, stinking cork tossed on an endless, angry ocean. Most of the men were seasick, huddled below decks in a haze of vomit and sweat. The air was thick with the smell of fear, diesel, and unwashed bodies. Elijah spent as much time as he could on deck, braving the cold, salty spray, just to breathe air that didn't taste like sickness. He'd watched the endless convoy of ships around them, destroyers, battleships, freighters, all moving in a grim, silent dance towards a single, terrible destination, Europe. One afternoon, Big Mac found him, his face a pale shade of green. "I'd rather face 100 Germans than this blasted ocean," he groaned, leaning heavily on the railing. "At least on land. The ground has the decency to stay still." Elijah smiled weakly and pulled out his harmonica. He played a simple, rhythmic shanty, something with a steady, rocking beat that mimicked the ship's violent sway. At first, Mac just glared at him, but soon, a few other soldiers, drawn by the familiar sound, gathered around. Elijah changed the tune to a livelier jazz number, and for a few minutes, feet tapped, shoulders loosened, and there were even a few strained laughs. The music was a tiny life raft in that vast, hostile sea. When the coast of France finally appeared, it wasn't a grand welcome. It was a line of muddy, greenish-brown under a low, gloomy sky. The port of Brest was a chaos of shouting men, clanging machinery, and the constant, distant thunder that wasn't a storm. That was the front. That was the war. They were met by a contingent of French soldiers. The French officers looked tired, their uniforms worn, but their eyes held a sharp, professional respect as they saluted Sergeant Williams. They were issued French helmets, distinctive, bull-like Adrian helmets, and French rifles, the long, bolt-action Lebel and Berthier models. "This is your weapon now," a French instructor said through a translator, his voice gravelly from smoke and command. "Learn it. Love it. It will save your life." They were also given something else, a new nickname. The French soldiers, struggling with the 369th Infantry Regiment, took one look at these determined, dark-skinned soldiers from New York and called them Les Soldats de l'Enfer, the soldiers of hell, the Hellfighters. The name stuck, and it filled the men with a fierce, grim pride. Their journey to the front was a slow, nerve-wracking crawl in the infamous 40-8 boxcars, so named because they could hold either 40 men or 8 horses. It was a dark, cramped, and miserable ride, the wheels clacking a monotonous rhythm on the tracks, a sound that was constantly interrupted by the ever-growing roar of the big guns. Finally, they reached the trenches. Nothing could have prepared Elijah for the trenches. It was a world dug out of the earth, a labyrinth of mud, filth, and despair. The stench hit him first, a thick, foul mixture of wet earth, rotting sandbags, cordite, and something else, something sweet and metallic that he tried not to think about. The walls were slick with mud, held up by wooden planks and woven sticks. At the bottom, a foot of murky, foul water sloshed, hiding who knew what. This was their new home. The first night was the longest of Elijah's life. The darkness in the trenches was absolute, a suffocating blanket. And it was never quiet. There was the constant drip, drip, drip of water, the scuttling of rats, enormous, bold creatures that seemed to own the place, and the endless, earth-shaking symphony of the artillery barrage. Shells screamed overhead, some landing far away with a muffled crump, others closer, shaking the ground and raining dirt down on their helmets. He huddled in a dugout, a small hole carved into the side of the trench, shivering with cold and a fear so profound it felt like a physical weight on his chest. He could hear the ragged breathing of the men around him. He could feel their terror, as palpable as his own. His fingers found the leather pouch in his pocket. He didn't dare take the harmonica out. The sound, however soft, could travel. It could give away their position. But just holding it, feeling its solid, familiar shape, was a comfort. It was a touchstone to a world where music was for dancing, not for drowning out the sound of dying men. A few days later, they got their first real taste of action. It wasn't a glorious charge, but a tense, terrifying game of cat and mouse. A German sniper had zeroed in on their section of the trench. For hours, no one could move. Any head that appeared above the parapet was met with the sharp crack of a rifle and a spray of splinters from the sandbags. The tension was unbearable. Men were crouched, white-knuckled, their eyes wide. Then, a young private, a kid from Brooklyn named Charlie, panicked. He broke from his position, scrambling down the trench, screaming for his mother. A shot rang out. It missed, but it was close. Sergeant Williams moved like lightning, dragging the sobbing boy into a dugout. The fear in the trench was now a living, breathing monster. They were pinned, helpless. Elijah, his heart hammering against his ribs, looked at the faces of his brothers. He saw the terror threatening to consume them. Without really thinking, his hand went to his pocket. He knew the risk, but he also knew that fear could kill you just as dead as a bullet. He curled his body deep into the dugout, creating a small, muffled space. He brought the harmonica to his lips, and he played, not a loud song, but the gentlest, softest lullaby he knew. The notes were barely a whisper, a ghost of a melody that was instantly swallowed by the mud and the distant thunder. But in the absolute, tense silence of that section of the trench, it was just audible. The men nearby turned. They didn't speak. They just listened. The simple, human sound, so utterly out of place in that hellscape, was like a cool hand on a fevered brow. It wasn't about joy. It was about sanity. It was a reminder that they were still men, not animals waiting for slaughter. The sniper didn't fire again. Maybe he moved on. Maybe he was just as confused by the faint, strange music as they were relieved by it. When Sergeant Williams came by later, his face was grim. He looked at Elijah, then gave a single, slow nod. No words were needed. In the land of thunder and death, a tiny, defiant whisper of music had just won its first small battle. Weeks bled into months, and the trench became their twisted, muddy version of normal. The initial, sharp edge of terror dulled into a constant, grinding anxiety. They learned the rhythm of the front, the frantic violence of raids and shelling, followed by the eerie, exhausting lulls. They learned to sleep through the thunder, to eat their tasteless rations with mud-caked hands, and to always be listening. It was during one of these lulls that a new kind of horror arrived. Not the loud, explosive kind, but a silent, creeping one. It started with a faint, chemical smell on the wind, sweet and cloying, like rotten fruit. A French sentry further down the line shouted a single, guttural word they'd been drilled to fear. Gas. Panic, cold and immediate, shot through the trench. Gas. 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 The cry was taken up, a desperate relay of terror. Men fumbled with the stiff, unfamiliar canvas of their French-issued gas masks. Elijah's heart felt like a wild bird in his chest as he ripped his mask from its satchel, his fingers suddenly thick and clumsy. He could hear Big Mac cursing violently as he struggled with his straps. He pulled the mask over his head, the world instantly narrowing to the two round eyepieces and the rasp of his own frantic breathing. A yellowish-green cloud, low to the ground like a malevolent fog, began to drift through their trench. It was chlorine gas. He saw a French soldier who hadn't been fast enough, stumbling and choking, his hands clawing at his throat as he collapsed into the mud. The sight, viewed through the foggy lenses of his mask, was something from a nightmare. They huddled in the trench for what felt like an eternity, the only sound the harsh, mechanical inhale and exhale of a dozen respirators. It was a suffocating silence, broken only by the occasional, muffled whimper of a man fighting his own terror. Elijah felt the fear pressing in, a physical weight. In the mask, he was alone with the sound of his own panic. Slowly, carefully, he reached into his tunic pocket. He couldn't play, not with the mask on, not with the gas still lingering. But he curled his fingers around the harmonica in its leather pouch. He focused on the feel of the tooled designs Lena had made, tracing the swirls with his thumb. He thought of her face, of the music shop, of the Savoy. He breathed, in and out, forcing his racing heart to slow its frantic pace. The gas eventually dissipated, blown away by a merciful shift in the wind. The all-clear was given, and they ripped off their masks, gulping in the foul, but breathable, air. The relief was immediate and profound. But the incident left a deep scar. The war wasn't just about bullets and shells anymore. It could poison the very air you breathed. A few nights later, a different sound began to haunt them. It started softly, then grew in intensity. It was a low, agonized moaning, coming from the blasted, cratered landscape of no man's land between the trenches. "Ghosts," whispered one of the younger soldiers, his eyes wide with superstitious dread. "The souls of the dead, stuck out there." Preacher shook his head, his face grim in the moonlight. "Not ghosts, son. That's a wounded man. One of theirs. Got caught in a wire during the last push, I'd wager. Been out there for days." The moaning continued, a relentless, heart-wrenching sound that frayed everyone's nerves. It was a constant reminder of their own mortality, of the agony that waited just a few hundred yards away. They couldn't launch a rescue. It was a suicidal mission. They couldn't shoot him. It felt too much like mercy, and mercy was in short supply. So they just had to listen. For 2 days and 2 nights, the sound went on, weakening but never stopping. Men stopped sleeping. They became irritable, jumpy. The morale of the entire section was crumbling under the weight of that single, suffering human being. On the 3rd night, Elijah couldn't take it anymore. The moaning was in his head, a soundtrack to his nightmares. He found Sergeant Williams. "Sarge, we have to do something. We can't just let him. We can't just listen to that." Williams' face was etched with exhaustion. "What do you propose, Jones? You want to charge out there and get yourself killed? I won't allow it." "Not that," Elijah said, an idea forming, desperate and crazy. "Music." Williams stared at him as if he'd lost his mind. "Music? That German boy is alone, scared, and dying. He's just a kid, like us. Maybe he just needs to know he's not alone in the dark. Maybe we all do." The sergeant was silent for a long time, listening to the faint, pitiful cries from no man's land. Finally, he sighed, a sound of utter weariness. "Do it, but keep it low. And if a sniper takes your head off, it's not my fault." Elijah made his way to the forward listening post, a dangerously exposed spot at the very edge of their line. The moaning was clearer here, a ragged, desperate sound. He took a deep breath, the cold air biting his lungs. He wasn't going to play a jig or a jazz tune. That would be an insult. He put the harmonica to his lips and began to play the only thing that felt right. It was a slow, mournful spiritual, "Sometimes I feel like a motherless child." The notes were soft, filled with a loneliness and sorrow that seemed to blend perfectly with the desolate landscape. They floated out over the barbed wire and the craters, a gentle, haunting offering in the night. For a moment, nothing changed. Then, the moaning from no man's land stopped. A profound, unnerving silence fell. Every man in that section of the trench held his breath. Elijah kept playing, the melody of fragile thread connecting 2 enemies in the shared darkness. He played for 10 minutes, the old, sad song speaking of a homesickness that knew no borders, no flags. When he finally stopped, the silence remained. The German soldier was quiet. No one spoke. But in the morning, when a brief truce was called to collect the dead, they found the young German soldier. He had died in the night, his body finally at peace. Clutched in his hand was a small, tattered photograph of a girl back home. Big Mac clapped a heavy hand on Elijah's shoulder. "You gave that boy a better death, Eli. You sent him off with a song instead of a scream. It wasn't a victory. There were no medals for that. But in the heart of all that industrialized slaughter, A simple harmonica had offered a moment of shared, painful humanity. And for the Harlem Hellfighters, that felt like a different kind of weapon. A weapon against the darkness. The relative quiet didn't last. The word came down the line, passed from grim-faced runner to grim-faced sergeant. They were going over the top. A big push. Their objective was a heavily fortified German position the French called Le Jardin du Diable, the Devil's Garden. The hours before the attack were a special kind of torture. Men checked and rechecked their rifles, their bayonets, their gas masks. Some wrote letters home, their hands shaking so badly the words were barely legible. Others just sat, staring at the mud walls of the trench, lost in their own private thoughts. The air was thick with the smell of damp wool, fear, and the coppery tang of impending violence. Elijah sat with his back against the trench wall, next to Big Mac and Preacher. Mac was methodically sharpening his bayonet with a stone. The SHHHHK sound a grim counter-rhythm to the distant shelling. "You know," Mac said, not looking up, "my daddy told me stories about the Hellfighters in the last war. Said they fought for 6 months on the front lines, longer than any other American unit. Never lost a man captured, never gave an inch of ground." He looked at Elijah, his eyes hard. "We got a reputation to live up to." Preacher had his Bible open on his knee, but he wasn't reading it. He was just staring at the pages. "The Lord is my shepherd," he murmured. "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death." He trailed off, his gaze distant. Elijah didn't have a bayonet to sharpen or a Bible to read. He had his harmonica. He held it in his hands, turning it over and over, the worn metal cool against his skin. He wasn't going to play it. Not now. It felt like it would be wrong. This wasn't a time for music. This was a time for stealing yourself, for locking away every soft and human part of you so you could do the terrible work that was coming. A young lieutenant, a white officer from Alabama who had earned their grudging respect by never asking them to do anything he wouldn't do himself, moved down the line. 5 minutes, men. Fix bayonets. Check your loads. Remember your training. God be with you. The final moments stretched into an eternity. Elijah felt a strange calm settle over him. The frantic fear was gone, replaced by a cold, hollow feeling in his gut. He slipped the harmonica back into its leather pouch and tucked it deep into his tunic pocket, right over his heart. He checked his French rifle, the bolt action smooth from practice. He fixed his bayonet, the long, cruel blade catching the dull morning light. Then came the sound they had all been waiting for and dreading. A shrill whistle cutting through the tense air. Hellfighters, up and over. "Let's go, go, go," Sergeant Williams roared, his voice raw with command. It was chaos, a wave of men scrambling up ladders and over the parapet, erupting from the trench and into the open. For a single, heart-stopping second, Elijah was standing upright in no man's land. The world opened up, a vast, torn-up landscape of craters, mud, and skeletal trees. Then the German machine guns opened up. The sound was like 1,000 sheets of canvas being ripped apart. Rat-a-tat-tat-tat. Men to his left and right were cut down, falling before they had taken 10 steps. The air was filled with the zip and whine of bullets. He ran, his legs pumping, his breath coming in ragged gasps. There was no thought, only instinct. Run. Forward. Always forward. He dove into a shell crater, landing hard in a pool of muddy water. Big Mac and Preacher landed beside him, their faces splattered with mud, their eyes wide. All around them, the battle raged. The roar of artillery was deafening, the ground shaking with each impact. The smell of cordite and blood was overwhelming. "Stay low," Mac yelled over the din. "We move from crater to crater. Follow me." They became a part of the machine of war. They advanced in short, desperate rushes, using whatever cover they could find. Elijah fired his rifle, reloaded, fired again. The world narrowed to the next crater, the next German position. He saw terrible things, things he knew would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. But he kept moving. They reached the first German trench. The fighting was close quarters, brutal, and personal. It was a whirl of bayonets, rifle butts, and desperate hands. Elijah found himself face to face with a young German soldier, no older than he was. The German's eyes were wide with the same terror Elijah felt. For a frozen second, they just stared at each other. Then the German raised his rifle. Elijah was faster. He fired. The boy crumpled. Elijah didn't feel triumph. He just felt sick. They cleared the trench, moving like demons, their training and their sheer, desperate will to survive carrying them forward. They were the Harlem Hellfighters, and they were taking the Devil's Garden, inch by bloody inch. During a brief lull in the fighting, as they consolidated their new position in the captured German trench, Elijah leaned against the wall, exhausted. He felt a sharp pain in his side. Looking down, he saw a tear in his tunic. A piece of shrapnel had grazed him. It was a shallow cut, but it was bleeding, and it had sliced right through the leather pouch in his pocket. His heart stopped. He fumbled inside, his blood-slick fingers finding the harmonica. He pulled it out. The little Hohner Marine band was undamaged, but Lena's beautiful, hand-tooled pouch was ruined, stained with his blood and torn beyond repair. He stared at it, a wave of grief washing over him that was somehow sharper than the pain in his side. It felt like the last piece of his old life had been violently severed. Preacher saw his face and put a hand on his shoulder. "The music's not in the leather, son," he said, his voice hoarse. "It's in you. It always has been." Just then, a German artillery shell, a screaming Jack Johnson from a big howitzer, landed directly on the section of trench they had just left. The explosion was massive, a thunderclap of earth and fire. The concussion hit them like a physical wall, knocking them off their feet. When the dirt settled, Elijah, dazed and ears ringing, looked back. Where a dozen of his brothers had been just moments before, there was now only a smoldering crater. They had survived. They had taken the objective. But the cost had been unimaginable. As the sun set on the Devil's Garden, the only sounds were the cries of the wounded and the crackle of burning debris. The harmonica in Elijah's hand felt heavier than ever. The victory at the Devil's Garden was a hollow one. They had taken the ground, but the cost was written in the empty spaces in their ranks, in the haunted look in every man's eyes. The 369th was pulled from the front line for a brief, precious period of rest in a quiet sector, a place where the war was supposed to be more of a grumbling argument than a screaming fight. The French village they were billeted in was a ghost of its former self. Most of the civilians were gone, and the buildings were pockmarked with shell and bullet holes. But it was above ground. It had streets and a square with a shattered fountain and roofs that mostly kept out the rain. To the Hellfighters, it was paradise. They were assigned to hold a line of forward outposts in a wooded area, facing a ridge where the Germans were dug in. The fighting here was sporadic, mostly just potshots from snipers and the occasional mortar round. It was a war of patience and watchfulness. It was here that Elijah found a new purpose for his harmonica. In the ruins of a small farmhouse that served as their platoon's command post, he started playing in the evenings. Not the soft, secretive lullabies of the trenches, but real music. He played the jazz standards they all knew from home. He played the jazz standards they all knew from home. He played the blues that spoke to their tired souls. He even learned a few simple French folk tunes from a grateful, elderly couple who had refused to leave their home. The music became a nightly ritual. Men would gather, cleaning their rifles or writing letters, just listening. For an hour each evening, the war retreated. They were just men again, bound together by a familiar rhythm. Even the gruff Sergeant Williams would lean in the doorway, a rare, unguarded look of peace on his face. This fragile peace was shattered one morning by a frantic French resistance fighter who stumbled into their post. He was breathless, his clothes torn, his eyes wild with urgency. "The Germans," he gasped, pointing towards the ridge. "They have brought up a Minenwerfer, a big one. They have it in a reinforced concrete bunker on the ridge. They are zeroing it in on the main French supply road. When the next big push comes, they will wipe out our reinforcements before they even reach the front." Their lieutenant studied the ridge through his binoculars. The bunker was a nasty piece of work, nearly invisible, with only a small firing slit showing. It was immune to rifle fire and would require a direct artillery hit to destroy, artillery that was too busy elsewhere. "We have to take it out," the lieutenant said, his voice grim. A small team, a raid. It was a suicide mission, crossing the open ground, assaulting a fortified position, all in broad daylight. But every man in the platoon volunteered. In the end, a team of 6 was chosen: Sergeant Williams, Big Mac, Preacher, Elijah, and 2 other veterans known for their cool heads and sharp shooting. Their plan was simple, brutal, and relied on sheer audacity. They would use a shallow, dry creek bed to get as close as possible, then make a final, desperate charge under covering fire from the rest of the platoon. As they prepared to move out, checking their gear one last time, Elijah felt a familiar knot of fear in his stomach. Big Mac saw his expression and grinned, a fierce, wild thing. "Don't you worry, Eli. When we get back, you're going to play us the St. Louis blues so loud, the Kaiser himself will hear it and surrender." Preacher just closed his eyes, his lips moving in a silent prayer. They moved like shadows, low and fast, through the creek bed. The damp earth smelled of rot and old leaves. Every crunch of a twig underfoot sounded like a gunshot in the tense silence. They could see the bunker now, a gray, menacing lump on the ridge above them. This was it. The final stretch was 100 yards of open, bullet-swept ground. Sergeant Williams gave the signal. Back at the farmhouse, their platoon opened up with everything they had, laying down a storm of rifle and machine gun fire at the German trenches to either side of the bunker, trying to pin them down. "Hellfighters, let's go!" Williams screamed. They burst from the creek bed and ran. It was a replay of the Devil's Garden, but somehow more intense, more personal. Bullets kicked up dirt at their feet. Elijah ran, his lungs burning, his world narrowed to the back of Big Mac's tunic in front of him. They were almost there. 30 yards. 20. Then, the German machine gun in the bunker's slit swiveled. It found them. Rat-a-tee-tee-tee-tee-tee-tee. The two men on the far side went down instantly. Preacher cried out, stumbling, a red stain spreading on his thigh. Sergeant Williams was hit in the shoulder, spinning around but staying on his feet. "Keep going," he roared, firing his pistol from the hip. Big Mac reached the bunker first. With a primal roar, he shoved the muzzle of his rifle into the firing slit and emptied his entire clip inside. The German machine gun fell silent, but it was too late. As Mac turned, a triumphant smile on his face, a single shot rang out from a German sniper in a nearby tree line. It caught him square in the chest. He stood for a second, a look of profound surprise on his face, then crumpled to the ground like a fallen giant. Elijah felt the world slow down. He saw Mac fall. He saw Preacher dragging himself towards the bunker, his leg leaving a trail of blood. He saw Sergeant Williams, wounded, trying to return fire on the sniper. They were pinned. The bunker was silent, but they were exposed. The rest of the German line was now focusing its fire on their position. They had accomplished their mission, but they were going to die here on this ridge. Elijah scrambled to Mac's side. There was nothing to be done. His big heart was still. Elijah's eyes filled with hot, angry tears. He looked at the bunker, at his fallen friends, at the hopeless situation. And then, an idea, born of grief and a furious, defiant love, sparked in his mind. He crawled to the bunker's firing slit. He pulled a grenade from his belt, pulled the pin, and tossed it inside. The explosion was muffled, final. The bunker was truly neutralized. But the German fire was intensifying. They were surrounded. Sergeant Williams slumped against the concrete, clutching his shoulder. "This is it, Jones," he grunted. "We gave him hell." Elijah didn't answer. His hand went to his tunic pocket. He pulled out the harmonica. It was smeared with mud and Mac's blood. He put it to his lips. He didn't play a spiritual. He didn't play the blues. He played the most raucous, joyful, foot-stomping jazz tune he knew. He poured all his pain, all his anger, all his love for his fallen brother into that little instrument. The notes flew out, loud and clear and utterly insane, a crazy, swinging defiance in the face of certain death. The German shooting slowed. Then it stopped. A confused, bewildered silence fell over the ridge. Who was playing music? In the middle of a battle? It was so utterly, profoundly human that it broke the rhythm of the killing. In that precious, confused silence, they heard a new sound, a sound they had almost given up hope of ever hearing again. It was the sound of French bugles. The main French counterattack had begun, hours ahead of schedule. The German position, distracted and confused by the crazy American playing jazz on a harmonica, was caught completely off guard. French soldiers, their blue coats a welcome sight, swarmed up the ridge. The Germans, their flank collapsing, began to retreat. The raid was over. The bunker was destroyed. The supply road was safe. They had won. A French captain, leading the charge, found them. He looked at the scene, the destroyed bunker, the dead, the wounded Sergeant Williams, and the young black soldier, covered in grime and blood, still holding a harmonica. He listened as a breathless Sergeant Williams, in broken French and English, explained what had happened. He explained how Big Mac had silenced the gun. He explained how Elijah's music had created the distraction that allowed the French attack to succeed. The French captain's face was a mask of awe and respect. He walked up to Elijah, who was still kneeling by Big Mac's body. He unpinned a medal from his own uniform. It was a bronze star, crossed with swords. He pinned it to Elijah's blood-stained tunic. La Croix de Guerre, the captain said, his voice thick with emotion. For unparalleled bravery in the face of the enemy. For France. Elijah didn't feel like a hero. He just felt tired and sad and empty. He looked down at the medal, then at the harmonica in his hand. It had saved them. It had cost them everything. The song was over. The silence that followed was the loudest thing he had ever heard. The war ended not with a bang, but with a strange, echoing silence. The news came down the line on a cold November morning in 1918. The armistice. It was over. For Elijah, the silence was the hardest part to bear. The constant thunder of artillery that had been the soundtrack to his life for over a year had stopped, leaving a void filled only by the wind and the memories of those who weren't there to hear the quiet. Big Mac, preacher, who had lost his leg but not his faith, and so many others. The journey home was a blur of cheering French crowds, long marches, and the slow, rolling passage on a troop ship across a now peaceful Atlantic. The men of the 369th were heroes. The French newspapers couldn't stop writing about Les Soldats de l'Enfer, the Harlem Hellfighters, who had spent 191 days in combat, never lost a prisoner, and never gave up an inch of ground they had taken. They marched up Fifth Avenue in New York City on February 17, 1919, in one of the most triumphant victory parades the city had ever seen. The sidewalks were a roaring, jubilant sea of people, their cheers so loud they seemed to shake the very buildings. Confetti rained down like snow. Elijah marched in his worn uniform, his French Adrian helmet on his head, the Croix de Guerre ribbon stark against the dark wool. He marched for Mac. He marched for Preacher. He marched for all the boys who had left Harlem but would never come back. He saw faces in the crowd, beaming with pride, but his eyes were searching for only one. And then he saw her, Lena. She was standing on a fire hydrant, waving a small American flag, her face streaked with happy tears. Their eyes met, and for the first time in a very long time, a genuine, unbroken smile found its way to Elijah's lips. The celebration was immense. There were speeches and banquets and handshakes from important men. But for Elijah, the real homecoming happened later, in the quiet of Lena's family's apartment. The sounds of the city, the familiar hum of traffic, the distant wail of a saxophone from a club downstairs, was a balm to his soul. He was home that he sat at the kitchen table, the same table where he'd shared countless meals before the war. Lena's mother placed a plate of fried chicken and collard greens in front of him, and the simple, familiar smell almost made him cry. He was safe. He was loved. Lena sat beside him, her hand covering his. She didn't ask about the war. She just waited. After a long silence, he reached into his pocket. He pulled out the harmonica. The nickel was scratched and dull, and it was still stained with the dirt of France and the blood of his friends. He laid it on the table between them. "It's seen a lot," he said, his voice rough. Lena looked at it, then at the torn, blood-stained leather pouch he placed beside it. "So have you," she whispered. He told her then. Not all of it. Some things were too heavy to put into words. But he told her about the trenches and the gas and the moaning in no man's land. He told her about the Devil's Garden and the feel of the mud. And he told her about Mac and his big laugh and how he fell on that ridge. He told her about the song that silenced the guns. He talked until his voice was hoarse and the streetlights outside had flickered on. When he was finished, he felt emptier, but lighter, as if he had set down a burden he'd been carrying for 1,000 miles. Lena listened to every word, her eyes never leaving his face. When he was done, she simply leaned forward and kissed his forehead. "You brought him home with you, Elijah," she said. "You brought all of them home, right there in that music." A few days later, he went to see Mr. Henderson at the music shop. The bell jangled the same way it always had. The old man looked up from behind the counter, his eyes widening behind his spectacles. "Elijah Jones," he breathed. "I read about you. The whole neighborhood's talking. He came out from behind the counter and embraced him, a rare show of emotion. A hero. Elijah shook his head. I came to get a new pouch. He held up the tattered, stained leather. This one, it's seen its war. Mr. Henderson nodded, understanding in his eyes. He found a new pouch, simple and sturdy. As Elijah was about to leave, the old man stopped him. Play something, Elijah. Let me hear it. Let me hear the music that came back from over there. Elijah stood in the middle of the shop, surrounded by silent guitars and gleaming saxophones. He put the harmonica to his lips. He didn't play a jazz tune or a blues. He played the slow, mournful spiritual he had played for the German boy in no man's land. The notes were clean and clear now, no longer muffled by mud or fear. They were filled with a sorrow that had been earned and a peace that had been hard won. When he finished, Mr. Henderson had tears in his eyes. That, he said, is a story that doesn't need any words. Life moved on. Elijah married Lena. He went back to fixing clocks, his clever hands finding their old rhythm. But he never stopped playing. He played at community dances, at church socials, and on the stoop on warm summer evenings. The children of the neighborhood would gather around, listening to the man with the metal and the harmonica that held 1,000 stories. He had carried his music to hell and back. It had been a weapon against fear, a prayer for the dying, a signal of defiance, and a threat of humanity in an inhuman world. And now, finally, it was just music again. A sweet, simple sound in the warm, familiar air of home. It was a lullaby for the past and a love song for the future. The war was over. The music played on,